Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer. I'm not out on another walk. I'm in my little studio. Today, I want to commemorate the beginning of the Second World War. 80 years ago, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, on the 3rd of September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. And this is significant because this war was so different from so many other wars. Certainly for UK citizens, it was the first time that the UK citizens were on the front line. Now, if you go back to the First World War, the Germans tried to attack using Zeppelins. These were hydrogen-filled airships that would float across the North Sea, and they dropped a few bombs, but they couldn't carry very much. They also tried to drop bombs using aeroplanes, but the aeroplanes couldn't get at that time across the whole distance. So they would tow them, very cunning. They would tow them with submarines on seaplanes that could take off near the beach and then go and drop planes. But again, not terribly effective and not really a sustained bombardment. But it was clear that the future of any warfare was going to be air supremacy. As we scroll through time to the 1930s, really we started to get an idea of what that was going to be like in 1937 in the Spanish Civil War, when Germany sided with Franco's nationalist side. And in the 22nd of April 1937, about 24 German planes and Italian planes, new state-of-the-art bombers, descended on a place called Guernica and dropped about 25 tons of bombs. Now, this was the first example, really, of carpet bombing. And reports came out that there were between 300 and 1,500 casualties. This had never been really seen before, and the rest of Europe took note. So, as war became a lot more on the cards, the British government knew they were going to have to do something. As all the rhetoric that Hitler started to spout out, it was clear that there was going to be some sort of fisticuffs, and air supremacy was going to be important. But the worry, of course, was that the UK citizens, as I said just now, was going to be on the front line. So what could they do? Well, they started to print in 1938 and deliver precautions and warnings and advice. It was very important that the government was seen to be telling people how to cope and alleviating panic. What they wanted to do was to stop that panic happening by telling people to think about how they could avoid any sort of problems should war start. But they were very keen also to highlight that it may not start. Of course, we know that in 1939 it did start, and in 1940, of course, we had the Battle of Britain and thereafter the Blitz. But the government was very worried that something should be done. So they sent out leaflets. First, they sent them out to the various forces that were going to help, like the fire brigade, the police, the volunteer forces like the air raid wardens, that sort of thing, giving them advice on what to do. And then they started to send out leaflets to every door of all the citizens explaining what might happen. And so you've got these. Now, this is a book that's been published actually fairly recently that's got all the leaflets that they put out in one compendium, I guess. And so that people were getting sent these and saying, why has this book been sent to you? And it's quite interesting, the sort of things they say. So it says, if this country was ever at war, the target of the enemy bombers would be the staunchness of the people at home. In other words, they were trying to demoralise people so that we would surrender, that the German might was seen to be too big and that we would capitulate. And it was very important that, of course, that we didn't capitulate and that we took necessary preparations. And so there were various different things that you could do. And of course, the main thing was the worry that people would be bombed. So you've got these interesting phrases that they said back then in 1938 when these leaflets came out, a year or so before war came. It said, the object of this leaflet is to tell you some of the things that you ought to know so that you are ready for the emergency of war. It doesn't mean that war is going to happen, they say. Further leaflets will be sent to give you further guidance. You've got to remember, these were the times they didn't have the internet. We didn't have things like Facebook and YouTube videos. You can imagine now we'd have a YouTube video on how to build your Anderson shelter or how to erect your Morrison shelter and get under this glorified table, because they had nothing on that. They relied on the newspapers, on the good old BBC, good old auntie, and of course leaflet distribution that would tell people what to do. The main thing was not to have panic and really grip the whole country together, pull them together as one, which you've got, again, remember back then we weren't quite such a divided country. We were pretty much the same culture across the board. Yes, there were a few different nationalities in there, but most people were living the British way of life. And so it was far easier to communicate everything because people had the same objective. And that was mainly to survive and win whatever conflict was likely to happen. So here we go. So the things that they were worried about was air raid warnings. So when air raids are threatened, warnings will be given in towns by sirens and hooters. And it does seem quite laughable now when we think, sirens and hooters was going to be the thing that would warn you. But of course, we do remember those sirens, and anybody who lived through it, I'm sure, will have a reaction to that sound in the pit of their stomach when the old warbling siren used to go. Like that. I did a version there myself to save me having to find the sound effect, because it is quite horrific. I mean, anybody who's seen those war films will know what a strange and awful sound that was, in fact, and probably put the fear of God into you, I would imagine. And as people took down to the shelters and things that they finally did make when war had happened. But so this was just the advice. Also, other warnings might be given by the police, or the air raid warnings by blowing short blasts on whistles, which again is so twee, isn't it, really? But they were the times. When you hear the warning, take cover. Remember that most of the injuries in an air raid are caused not by direct hits of bombs, but by flying fragments of debris and shells, which was probably a very true statement. Stay under cover until the sirens or hooters sounding, again for at least 2 minutes, which means raiders passed. That was the signal, raiders passed. All of this, I mean, it's interesting because the government had really thought seriously and hard about how they were going to protect citizens and what they should do. I think that people, as the time went on and we saw that Europe was invaded, it was very clear that a lot of people were extremely worried that we would get invaded. And of course, many people wanted to capitulate and sue for peace with Hitler until, of course, in May, Winston Churchill came along and was having none of that. But that was in the future. Gas masks was a thing that was issued. People were issued with that because we'd had poison gas in the First World War. That mustard gas had been wafting across the trenches, and although that was against the Geneva Convention, it was a thing that they thought, well, it could happen. So people were being issued with leaflets on how to wear a gas mask, not just for adults, but also for children and even babies. And that's incredible. The lighting restrictions, of course, we all know about the blackout. Put that bloody light out and all of that. these were the messages that were going out 80 years ago at this time. The fire precautions, what to do if an incendiary device comes down. They were starting to think about evacuation. And it's quite interesting here. Arrangements have been made by the government for the voluntary evacuation from certain parts of the London area and some of the large towns of school children, children below school age, if accompanied by their mothers, or other responsible persons, I suppose, other responsible person taking the children, expectant mothers, and adult blind persons who couldn't be moved. I'm not quite sure what they were going to do with the disabled or people who were deaf, who may not hear the siren. But that's it, things were being organised. Identity labels. Again, it's only 80 years ago. This is one person's life. The average lifespan these days. In war, you should carry your name and address clearly written. This should be on an envelope, a card, or luggage label, not, it says, on some old piece of paper that's easily lost. Now, you could argue that an envelope is some old bit of paper that could be easily lost, but hey, that's it. In case of children, the label should be fastened, e.g. sewn, onto their clothes in such a way as it will not readily be detached. Food, of course, they were worried that people were going to suddenly start stockpiling food, as people do. We've seen that in recent little problems that we've had. And it wasn't that it was illegal to do that, but it was that sense of fair play that was being thrust out. The government make arrangements so that there'll be sufficient supplies of food and that every person will be able to attain regularly his or her fair share, and so on. But if some people try to buy abnormal quantities before the full scheme of control is working, they will be taking food which should be available to others. So that sort of sense of fair play was in order, and it's as I say, it is quite sort of twee when we look back at how this was put across. And then finally, it just goes on this particular leaflet. It explains how further information is going to happen through leaflets, through good old Auntie, BBC and newspapers. It must have been a worrying time with this. There was a lot of talk about it. And of course, we know that once war declared, I think about 15 minutes after, on the 3rd of September, when war was declared, there were people testing the sirens, and there was mild panic as people were running out to whatever shelters there were available, thinking that a raid was actually happening. And of course, it wasn't. It was just a number of people testing out the sirens. We know that there followed this whole period of really watching what was going on in Europe, and known as the phony war, because nothing was really happening and it was all going to be over by Christmas, and really it was a whole load of nonsense. But of course, as we know, that as we got into the next year, things started to ramp up a bit. Well, I aim to go out and make some videos about what happened during the Second World War, and in particular the period known as the Battle of Britain from the 10th of May onwards, and then the Blitz and during the bombing. I want to go to some of the sites locally to me and around the country where not only we had the RAF aerodromes and all of that sort of stuff, but where planes have come down, how people coped, trying out recipes of the rationing that then went out, and the whole attitude. So lots of interesting things. I'm fascinated by this particular period of time, mainly because I think it's the first time, really, for UK people that we as civilians were on the front line. The enemy was coming over our heads, and our plucky Englishmen managed to hold it together. As Winston Churchill said, the first of the few. But it wasn't just the airmen, it was everybody who pulled together like we've never seen since. And the phrase, the Blitz spirit, came into something. I think that's, in many ways, greatly missing. We're going through a particular turmoil time now where the country is divided, when, a bit like in the late 1939 and in the 1940s, we ought to be coming together for the good of the nation. So that's the aim. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. I will be out and about doing my usual walks and explorations, but in the forthcoming months, I'm going to be looking at 80 years ago and commemorate that particularly difficult time and see how we coped. Give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to follow, like and subscribe. Become a patron and support what I do. A little bit of income helps to put petrol in the car. But until next time, take care one and all, and thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.